Hello, everyone. My name is William Lee, and I have a PhD in Russian history from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at the University of London. And some of you hopefully already know that if you are subscribers or viewers of my YouTube video series on Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich of Russia. I'm here sitting in what was at one time his bedroom at Sanatorium Schatzalp in Davos, Switzerland. Now it is Hotel Schatzalp, and so there's a very slight Russian connection here, but the topic of this video is not Grand Duke Dmitry, it's Dr. Zhivago, a book that I just finished my third reading of, and every time I read the book, I'm simply more impressed by it. It's an amazing, amazing work of literature, and the reason I'm doing this really is because I'd seen some other YouTube videos about Dr. Zhivago, and I was a little dissatisfied to see that, not that people dislike the book, there are brilliant works of literature that I know are brilliant that I don't like, but that there seemed to be a lot of misunderstanding that was getting in the way of people's enjoyment of the book. Because if you don't really understand a book, then it's going to be harder for you to enjoy it, for sure. So I thought I would do, while it's fresh in my mind from the third reading, I thought I would do my own little video about it with 10 points which hopefully will be helpful for understanding the book if you decide to dive into it, and for getting the context and getting the most out of it and really, really enjoying it. So I am not a scholar of Russian literature, of literature of any kind. I'm a scholar of Russian history, so that's helpful. But of course, I can't claim that this is a valid work of literary criticism or literary scholarship, because that's not my specialty. So anyway, let's dive in. And you can ask yourself, if you haven't read the book, should I read Dr. Zhivago? If you've read the book and you kind of felt like you didn't get it, then maybe read it again. Okay. So number 1 of 10, it's very helpful to understand it in the context of Russian literature specifically, because there are certain aspects of Russian literature that a lot of times people unfamiliar with Russian literature find very off-putting. I don't know how many people have stopped reading War and Peace before they've even gotten through the first chapter, because they feel like they're deluged by Russian names that are unpronounceable and incomprehensible. And you are going to find in Dr. Zhivago that you also have a large cast of characters who come and go from the narrative and who have names that seem very difficult and complicated. And one thing that's helpful to remember is that the way Russian names work is you have a Christian name, a first name, and let's say Nikolai, and then you have a patronymic, which means it's your father's name. Whether you're a man or a woman, you have your father's name. So if you were a man named Nikolai and your father was also named Nikolai, you would be Nikolai Nikolaevich Ivanov, let's say. And if you were a woman and your name was Natalia, you would be Natalia Nikolaevna, and then your surname. And beyond that, the polite form of address was not Mr. Ivanov or, Mrs. Kuznetsova. the polite form of address was not to use the surname at all. It was to use the first name and the patronymic. So if I was to meet somebody for the first time, I would not call them Mr. So-and-so. I would call them, if it was their name, Nikolai Nikolaevich. And so that's the polite form. So when you're reading the book and that's how somebody is being referred to, then you know there's a little bit of formality. So even with the main character, Zhivago, and with his lover, for a long time she calls him Yuri Andreevich. So Yuri, the son of Andrei. And that's significant because it's telling you that they're not quite on fully familiar terms yet. Okay, so yeah, just again to reiterate, just sort of embrace the idea that Russian literature has certain characteristics, not just this book. And if you're going to read Russian literature, you more or less have to adapt to them. And you know, don't let yourself be put off, because as you go along with the book, it will become easier. Okay, the second point. Well, almost everybody who does a video on YouTube about Dr. Zhivago talks about how it's not a romance novel. And if you go in thinking that you're going to be reading a romance novel, you're going to be disappointed. There is a romance in the novel. There is a passionate love affair in the novel, but it's not a romance novel per se. It wasn't written to be exploring this issue of the romancing of a woman by a man. And yeah, it also doesn't belong to the romantic school. Like another book that is sometimes misunderstood as a romance novel, Wuthering Heights. Well, at least Wuthering Heights belongs to the romantic school of literature, even though it's not a romance novel per se. Well, Dr. Zhivago does not belong to the romantic school of literature. So it's not a romance novel in that context either. What it is, though, is a love story. That it is from beginning to end. So if you can see the distinction between a romance and a love story, then Dr. Zhivago is the latter. And, you know, I'm going to try to steer clear of spoilers for the most part, but I think this is something that will actually help you as you read the book to keep in mind that the romance, that the love is actually, rather than romance, is actually between Zhivago and Russia. You see over and over again comparisons of Russia, not just to the familiar one that we all know of Mother Russia, but also of Russia as a young maiden. And Russia, if Zhivago is in love with Lara, it's primarily because she is for him a personification of Russia. So keep that in mind as you read the book, and I think it will really augment your understanding and your enjoyment. And, you know, Zhivago, unlike other people in the book, is determined not to leave Russia, no matter how hard life becomes there under the Bolsheviks and under the Soviet regime. And even though he has a couple of opportunities to get out of Russia, as so many people did from the upper classes in the bourgeoisie, he does not, because Russia is his lover. Okay, number 3, don't expect to understand everything. This is kind of going back to part 1. Just go with the flow. Don't get annoyed because you don't understand everything that's going on at any given moment, because the events that are talked about in this book are just chaos. They were chaos. The people who were experiencing them didn't know what to think. They were also in a state of great confusion, and that's a deliberate part of the narrative, and it's one of the points of the book. So just if you know that going in, then it's not going to frustrate or upset you. Then you're going to be able to just go with the flow, which is the best thing to do. Okay, number 4, because this book was written for readers who were familiar with the historical events described, Pasternak is not going to go into, is not going to explain them to you. So, and I realized that I stupidly didn't even mention the name of the author, Boris Pasternak. he's just not going to explain these things to you because he wrote the book in Russian, in Russia, and people were familiar with these events. So before you start, there are 5 major events in the history of Russia that take place during the scope of this book in a relatively small period of time. Actually 6 if you include the Second World War. So all you have to do with any of these is just skim a Wikipedia article. You'll see the dates, you'll see just an overview of what's going on, and then you'll get that part of it. So, and I'll just mention quickly, the first thing that happens is the 1905 revolution. So there was a revolution in Russia, a failed revolution. The Tsar survived it, although he did reluctantly grant the people a legislative body, a parliament called the Duma. So in 1905, there was this revolution that failed on the one hand, but on the other hand, did bring in some reforms. So when, you're not very far into the novel before the 1905 revolution comes into play, and it's important. So then we have the First World War. Russia was on the side of the Entente, of the Allies, fighting against Austria and Germany. Then after that, we have 2 more revolutions. So we have a total of 3 revolutions. 1917, there was not 1 revolution, there was 2. There were 2. The first was the February Revolution, and that brought in a democratic regime called the Provisional Government. And the Provisional Government was going to hold a constituent assembly and free elections and go from there. And try to make Russia a modern secular democracy. If that was what the people wanted, it was all going to be voted on. And that failed. It lasted a few months, and then you had the October Revolution, which is the one, people tend to conflate the February and the October Revolution. So the February Revolution brought down the Tsarist regime, and the October Revolution was the one that brought the Bolsheviks to power, really the extremists. And it was the October Revolution that led to the killing of the Tsar and his family, and led to in the future the Soviet regime. So you have both of those revolutions. The head of the Provisional Government was Kerensky, who sort of mentioned on the side. And the October Revolution, you have Lenin. And then after the October Revolution, you went right into the Russian Civil War, which lasted until basically 1921, when the remainder of the Tsarist troops made their way to the Crimea and were evacuated. So those are the events. At the very end of the book, you have the Second World War, but that's only really briefly in passing. Okay, so point number 5. Understand that this is a book written by a poet. So Boris Pasternak was a poet. The main character, Zhivago, is a poet, and indeed many of his poems, Zhivago's poems, which were of course written by Pasternak, are included in the book. A lot of them. Especially at the end, there's kind of an appendix with lots of Zhivago's poems, and Zhivago sees the world as a poet would see the world, not as a politician or a revolutionary or some other kind of person, but as a poet. So I know some people were frustrated by that. They didn't understand how he could be experiencing the events around him in this way. But if you keep that in mind, then whether you appreciate that or not, you will understand it. Okay, point number 6. Bear in mind that Zhivago is a fatalist. He believes that fate determines things in the end. And that is one aspect of what people sometimes call the great Russian soul. Fatalism can be a part of that. The last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, was famously a fatalist, and it certainly led to his demise. And Zhivago is similar. He's very inert. He's very passive when it comes to making decisions. he believes in leaving things up to fate. And so that is something, again, that in other videos I saw people express some real frustration with. But we're looking here at a Russian novel, at a Russian exploration of one aspect of the Russian soul through this character. So you have other Russian novels, like there's a famous one called Oblomov, about a man who basically never gets off of his sofa. And again, that is sort of an exploration of what the author considered a sickness in the Russian soul among the aristocracy and the nobility, that they'd lived until the 1860s being never having to lift a finger because they had serfs, basically slaves. And so this sort of passivity crept in some cases. But you also have another example of a type in the character Strelnikov, which is the will. There's almost some fatalism there in the sense that no matter whether it seems like I'm going to succeed or not, I am going to live my life in accordance with the will, with exercising the will as the greatest good, at least for me. So you have both of those, but it's Zhivago, of course, who's the main character. And he's very existential and fatalistic in his outlook. So if you're going to read the book, then you have to accept that aspect of the main character, or else if you're looking for a more active protagonist, you're going to be unhappy. All right, so number 7, people, to my surprise, express some distress about the fact that you don't have figures like Lenin and Trotsky at the forefront in the book. But again, Zhivago is quite passive. He's a poet, he's a philosopher, but he's not a politician. He's in the midst of all this chaos. He's not thinking about, what's going on in the Kremlin right now, what's going on with Lenin and Trotsky. So that didn't bother me. Okay, it would have been interesting if they'd been mentioned, but it's not surprising that they aren't. It's not like the author, this was this huge oversight on his part, not at all. Okay, another thing that particularly on this reading made the book meaningful to me was thinking about the universal experience of refugees during wartime. And we have that very much to the fore now in 2025. And, if there's one thing that this book succeeds in doing, it's making it crystal clear how absolutely, almost unimaginably abhorrent it is to lose your home during a crisis like this, and to be struggling just to survive as a refugee, even as a refugee within your own country during a civil war. So if you think about that, then when you're reading this book, then at no point are you going to ask yourself, does this book have any point or any purpose for existing? Because in my mind, it's one of the best depictions of that in literature that I've ever come across. Okay, number 9. Let the movie and the book stand as related but separate works of art. I'm not a big fan of the movie, although, David Lean, amazing director. I think his Lawrence of Arabia was his best work, rather than Dr. Zhivago. I think Dr. Zhivago is worth seeing, but there's just not much of a connection between the book and the movie. The one is a Russian work, the one very much is not. And, whether you start with reading the book and then watch the movie or vice versa, if you're not going to come away from that disgruntled, then you need to understand that each one is in its own realm a work of art, but the connection between them is really not that great. Okay, number 10. Bear in mind that great literature, whether it's Russian or non-Russian, is more about pondering the big philosophical questions than it is about providing entertainment or a moral message or an uplifting message. That's not what this book is about. You have, again, I hear complaints about the philosophy in the book, but that's what this book is about. It's about the big questions, pondering the big questions for Russia, but also universally. Okay, so that's about it, except that I just wanted to mention a few things that if you do read the book and you want to do further reading, there are some books and a movie that I would recommend. So the first book would be The White Guard by Mikhail Bulgakov, and that is set at the very end of the revolution with the beginning of the Civil War. It's the really autobiographical experience of the author, although it's presented as a work of fiction, and it's set in Kiev, and it is the White Guard are the Tsarist Russian troops that are there fighting street-to-street fighting against both the Ukrainian nationalist troops and the Red Army. And so you have the kind of sheer chaos that you have in Dr. Zhivago as well, and it's a brilliant book. Then you have And Quiet Flows the Don by Mikhail Sholokhov. I'm not sure where the stress is on that, even though I speak and read Russian, I always get tripped up with stress unless I've heard something pronounced. So that, again, is a book that covers sort of the same time period. Pre-war, war, and then the Civil War. And it's from the point of view of a Cossack, just an ordinary Cossack, not a member of the educated upper class or the bourgeoisie. So it's a very different, and not a poet. So it's a very different perspective from what you have in Dr. Zhivago. And again, you see the absolute horror of civil war and the chaos where people might switch from the reds to the whites and then back again. And what you are on any given day has, in most instances, less to do with ideology than the question of how you're going to survive. So that is a book that complements Dr. Zhivago very well. Then two works of nonfiction, Les Russes Blancs by Alexander Zhivakov, the son or rather grandson of Russian emigres who left at the time of revolution. It's about primarily about the Russian emigre experience in France after the revolution and during the Civil War. And it's absolutely a fascinating book. So in Dr. Zhivago, some of Dr. Zhivago's family members leave Russia and end up in Paris. And if you want to see what life was like for Russian emigres who left Russia during and after the revolution, then this book is the perfect complement to Dr. Zhivago, and it raises things from the outside perspective or from an alternate perspective. For instance, Zhivago's relatives are actually deported. They're Russian intellectuals who are actually deported from Russia. And so Les Russes Blancs talks about that experience for the people who became emigres not voluntarily, but because they were deported from Soviet Russia. And so it hasn't, unfortunately, been translated into English, so you have to be able to read French. But it's an excellent book, an excellent resource. The other one is in English. It's called Former People by Dr. Douglas Smith, a historian of Russia like myself. And the former people of the title are people like Zhivago who were determined not to leave Russia or in the end weren't able to get out, but a lot of them stayed voluntarily. But they were given this designation former people under the Soviets because they were considered parasites and just people of no value in the Soviet state. So that is a fairly harrowing work as well. And again, it very much complements what Pasternak writes about in Dr. Zhivago. Finally, there's a movie that I like very much called The White Countess. I think it's from maybe the early 2000s. I can't remember. And it's about... So white in the context of Russian history means tsarist. So it's about a family of Russian aristocrats who get out of Russia through the Far East and end up in China, in Shanghai, without money. You know, a noble family with with titles of prince and count and countess and princess, and how they live or try to live in Shanghai as refugees. A movie that I like very much, and that is a romance movie, or a movie with a romance. I shouldn't say it's a romance movie. There's much more to it than that. And finally, you could take a look at my own YouTube series on Grand Duke Dmitri and I'm going through his diaries, one entry per video. And right now, just finishing up 1921. And so you have his perspective, the perspective of a Romanov, of a member of the Russian royal house, his perspective on the emigration. He was at that time living in France and trying to find a role for himself within the Russian immigration. So that, of course, is another perspective on all of this. So, you know, you can't go wrong with any of those as far as broadening your perspective of that historical experience for people. And I thank you very much for watching. This is kind of a one-off. Every once in a while, I do a book review or something on a book. Last time was on the famous white chapter of Moby Dick. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm always interested in hearing people's comments. And yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.